Thank you very much, Ro, and thank you, everyone. I've been quite looking forward to sharing our work that we're doing. I just also wanted to let everyone know that Jerry Roberts is online as well, and he was directly involved in a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about. So if I can do my presentation and then save questions for the end, but if you did want to put anything in chat, Jerry, if you don't mind keeping an eye on that for me and providing some support with questions later. So as Ray said, I'm a Senior Extension Officer with Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and I'm based in Townsville now, but I spent about 8 years in Charters Towers and became an Extension Officer when reef water quality was becoming a key factor in the Burdekin catchment. So I've been working in that space for a long time with graziers on reef water quality projects. And today, what I want to talk about, it's more of a journey. I wouldn't say that we've come to a definite conclusion of the direction or what we're achieving, but it's a journey that we're on in the Burdekin catchment to determine and develop a means of delivering consistent and effective extension services, particularly in a reef regulation space. And the direction that we have been working on has been based on research that was done in 2019. And this has been then used as a guide to develop a framework to support extension staff with the uptake of improved management practices. And it came about due to a desire to better understanding the impact that we're having as extension officers and how we can improve our processes. So I'm just going to start with a bit of background and the research that led to our process or where we are now. So since 2011, we've been regularly undertaking evaluation of our reef water quality projects in the Burdekin catchment. And this has been in the form usually of surveying graziers. And these were one-off surveys of individual businesses. So then it was proposed to undertake a longitudinal survey. And this was of a sample of the graziers that had been previously surveyed to then develop a better understanding of what and why practice change occurred in their businesses and to gather insight into how we could design appropriate extension programs and activities to broaden the influence. So in 2019, in August, the longitudinal survey regarding practice change was undertaken by Jerry Roberts from the GR Consulting for the DAF extension project. And Jerry interviewed 30 graziers that were known to have made management practice changes or have reported making changes following undertaking programs with or activities with DAF and also with other service providers, so that we could get a broad understanding of the types of things that influence their decision making when they were making changes. 93% of those 30 graziers, so 28 of them, have continued using the changes that they'd reported on previously. So it was a good foundation to gather information from. The survey, initially, we developed a number of research questions that we wanted to get a better understanding for, and then the survey questions were then designed on the research questions. And then when the survey was undertaken, and the type of assistance that does or could support management practice change was explored by Jerry in 3 ways. So by asking graziers what assistance they'd received that contributed to the practice change, and then later on in getting multiple responses, what could service providers do to assist graziers in the grazing business when they were wanting to make a change or had made the decision to make a change? And then specifically how DAF could help, what sort of services could be of more practical use to graziers. The results from the longitudinal survey showed that there were 3 categories of commonly delivered extension services, also support that were being provided. And so these were that information, knowledge, and new ideas were being accessed by graziers, that support with skills to implement the practice changes were available, and that the specialist support, for example, business analysis, was also available. But when delving more into the topic about what service providers could do to assist the graziers in the grazing business to make the decision to make a change, and how DAFF could specifically make services of more practical use to graziers, 6 categories emerged. These categories are listed here in the frequency of the mention as they came up in the surveys that Jerry undertook. So to support, to have support to implement or trial a management practice before taking it on a broader perspective in their business. That activities that were undertaken were known to be locally relevant and to be held locally. Other graziers using the practice now are particularly linked to being locally relevant and locally held. Evidence of the advantage of the change over current practice. So why should I, as a grazier, change my practice? What is the advantage? And this is not limited to financial. This could be also in terms of time, for example. Access to specialist information services. And then finally, to remember that graziers know their property and business situation well. So the importance of talking through graziers about where their business is at now and what are their needs and motivations and perspectives related to the business. So once Jerry had completed the survey process and analysed all the information that came together into those initial 3 categories and then also the 6 categories, we took that a step further before we could make any sort of applied processes with the information to verify the categories. So ideally, these would have been face-to-face verification workshops, and they also would have included graziers that hadn't been a part of the initial survey. But unfortunately, we're hitting the prime of COVID. So May 2020 was when we wanted to go through this process. So we had to alter that slightly so that there was, we brought together 7 of the surveyed businesses and we developed Zoom meetings to get input into whether those categories reflected how they responded to the surveys. And we looked at different businesses across the Burdekin King catchment. So there are a number of extension officers involved in that process with Jerry. And the consensus was that the outcomes were an accurate summary of things that service providers could do to assist them, as in the people that had were contributing, or other graziers. And some of the graziers in the verification process did raise the point that not all graziers know their business well. However, this is still did not take away from the fact that the graziers are the ones that know their business and need to that relationship and understanding of their perspective of their business was an important factor. So we then, with using Jerry's report, looked at recommendations to a systems approach so that a service provider can have the whole of the process or system involved, and how we could do this with the 6 categories and how they fit in. So on top of the verification process with the graziers involved in the survey, we also sought input from a consultant in Southern Queensland to see if her experiences were similar. Other graziers, other surveys that Jerry has undertaken showed a very similar theme, and also the literature. So some of the 6 categories are matched to categories known to impact adoption as recorded in the agriculture extension literature of Pennell et al. 2006 and Patterson and Roberts 2006, which does add additional support to them being of relevance. So once we'd gone through that process, we had to work a way of how would these categories then form a systems approach within delivering extension in the Burdekin catchment, and looking towards increasing the rate of adopting practice management. So we developed an applied model extension flowchart. And in the slide, you can see you can't actually see the details of it, but what the flowchart looked like. It was quite a rough or raw application of the categories initially to get an idea of how they flowed. And they do flow and support each other. That we started with categories that became steps and realized that steps is too restrictive, that they're principles that could be not necessarily have to follow each other. Once we took this back to extension staff in terms of how this process could be applied, we had the feedback that the flowchart was quite a restrictive way of doing it. So we modified it into an infographic and then developed guidelines to the principles. We're also, when I say we, I'm talking predominantly Jerry and myself, but also with support from other people in the extension team in DAF based in the Burdekin. And I looked extensively at, and it was around the same time that Angela was putting together the Queensland agricultural model of extension. And a lot of what was being come out of that was reflecting and validating what we had found through the longitudinal survey. We also referred to the New Zealand extension model, and then linked in with Angela Williams' work, but the Engaging Parents model with the Murdoch Institute of Child Health, particularly that key factor about reciprocally beneficial relationships. Our objectives then with an applied model was to have a framework that describes how DAF Burdekin staff can consistently deliver extension activities. So it was recognised that a lot of these things are already occurring within the way that extension is delivered, not just in our DAF Burdekin team, but quite generally, but that if we wanted to lead to more consistent practice change, then we needed to consistently deliver extension activities based on these categories. And so that the entry into this framework when delivering extension could begin at any of the 6 principles, depending on where grazier was at when you were working with them, although that understanding where a grazier at was definitely a key factor. It also links in with a number of programs that are already delivering extension particularly within the Burdekin. And the objective was to facilitate a shift so that we were assisting and linking graziers to support with other graziers rather than relying on a long-term intervention by extension officers. So we put together the infographic and took it to the extensions team in terms of a model, and we asked that the extension team in the Burdekin apply the model to their extension activities as a pilot of a model. And so there were 7 extension staff that work on projects in the Burdekin team, mostly young staff, a good percentage of them new to extension, but also some more experienced staff in there. One of the key requirements of this applying the model was to develop a peer coaching support. So and we've still got a couple of peer coaching sessions to go. So we've been meeting each month to do some peer coaching support with each other. And this has taken the form of both structured and also informal type coaching, and has been a key key element in the extension staff, communicating with each other, but also pulling apart and testing the principles that are making up the model. And we also had some initial evaluation of the Grazier Extension Officer interactions early on. So this process, it's been a very interesting process, and there's been quite a number of discoveries that came out of it. The key one being that the model is probably more effectively considered as applied service delivery principles, that the principles are all very important, but as a standalone model, there's a lot more work that we need to do. And that's one of the reasons that I described this process that we're on as a journey. And particularly when we're working in a reef-regulated environment, when we're delivering practice change, that some of that practice change or management that can be put into place is about increasing the productivity and profitability of people's businesses. And it is quite, what's the word? Easy, but the interactions and relationship buildings on those bases come quite naturally, whereas influencing practice change when the external requirements are more apparent, such as the reef regulations. So that sort of highlighted.
Megan?
Yes, Jerry.
I have a question came in.
Yes?
Would you like to take it now? It fits in with where you just were.
Okay.
So the question's from Marie Vitelli. Is peer coaching support available to mentor producers too, or only to departmental extension staff?
So in the process that we've been using with our extension staff, it's been an internal staff, but all of those, nearly everyone that's been involved has been involved in peer-to-peer facilitation training to then develop the skills and understanding of how to work with graziers and develop those peer coaching groups. And also I'm aware of a number of other groups that within our extension project that have been developed as peer-to-peer. So it's so in this particular incident with the model, it was just internally, but it's definitely something that our staff are working towards involving with other people and building that basis so that people can support each other. And it has definitely been probably one of the key things that the extension staff that have been involved, the enthusiasm for it has sort of increased as we've gone along, because they've been able to talk to each other about what they've been doing or how things have gone, and learn from each other in that way. And it's also allowed them to then develop the skills to work with graziers and in a similar fashion. Does that answer your question, Marie?
Yes. Some time ago, I think, through the industry groups, we identified the importance of other producers mentoring producers, and ideally like a sitting fee for the time that producers put into that, because producers listen to other producers, as you've alerted. But I'm just wondering, with your peer coaching, whether it was just an internal process or helping some of those coach, mentor producers to help others. That's fine. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. It all is sort of a part of a bigger picture, and I think the developing and learning the skills within the extension team is making it more able for that to be extended to the greater population. So which brings me to how, rather than a model, that these were applied service delivery principles that are applied as a larger framework. This process, particularly the peer coaching, and then the evaluation, which was just of a small, only a small sample, but the evaluation of the grazier extension and extension officer interactions has identified the gaps in resources and the support that extension officers need to develop the skills to, one, expand the peer coaching to the wider audience, but also just to deliver the principles. And we have also identified that it's difficult to increase the rate of practice change until we understand what our specific practice change goals are and how to measure that. And often, particularly in the reef water quality, there is quite a broad overarching goal, for example, reducing the sediment runoff to the reef. But understanding what the little steps and the incremental change that builds to that are and how we measure that is going to be an effective way of identifying that practice change is occurring, and then also how it can be done more effectively. So
Another
finally,
question, Megan?
yes, go for it.
Noel Ainsworth asking, did the practice change goals capture most of the landholder interests and align with their preferred delivery techniques? You mentioned practice change goals before, with a view to understanding what they are before
yes.
being able to move forward, was what you'd said.
Yes, so those practice change goals, and that's and I'll speak about it a little bit more in the next slide, but it's quite a broad, and that's where the determining and differentiating what they are. Those goals could be something that's relevant to the grazier, but then also linked. So, for example, their management within, whether it's applying best management practices within reproduction or nutritional grazing land management. And that's the key areas that in grazing, that grazing extension officers work with graziers are in their whole of business, is considering their efficiency of their breeding herd, the nutritional requirements, and the grazing land management, and how all of those things impact each other. But we don't really have a way of measuring specifically the little things that we're working on with a grazier where there might be incremental changes. So for example, working with a grazier in terms of reproduction and changing and then making changes to their breeding program or how they monitor their breeding program, and then as a result of any changes, potentially getting more calves out of less cows, and then that could have a carry-on effect onto the grazing land management. And then how are they monitoring their grazing land management? For example, do they use something like the Stocktake GLM app? So these are just little incremental things that build up to the bigger change. So I guess when I'm talking about practice change goals, it's something that still has to be defined, because it's a very broad subject, and that is, I guess, for want of a better word, a weakness within understanding the extension that needs to be delivered. Did that? Did you want any more clarification? Did that answer the question?
Yeah, look, thanks for that, Megan.
No worries, thank you. So as I said, from looking at starting with a plan to develop a model as a framework for delivering extension in the Burdekin catchment, and then taking that out into the real world, I guess, and having extension officers look at that, how that fits in. There were definitely progress made from the peer coaching in integrating those principles. So for example, one of the peer coaching activities that were undertaken were to take the 6 categories and use those to design a workshop or an activity. And that was quite a clear application of those 6 categories when you're putting forward how you're going to design a workshop, ensuring that there's specialists, that there's an expert on the topics that is relevant to the workshop, that you're holding it somewhere locally and you're ensuring that the information that's being delivered is locally relevant, inviting graziers in the area that have been using practices to talk about their experiences and that the advantages that they've found, ensuring that they're interactive workshops for example, so that the graziers are sharing their experiences and how it reflects with their business. So that was one of the outcomes from the peer coaching, was they definitely developed a better understanding of the principles and how they could be applied. But we also drew out of that some expectations from the extension officers in terms of a framework, and they found that there was a clear application to project planning and work planning discussions, that these categories to help that work planning would definitely give a more effective and consistent drive there. And then once, as I said, the principles being applied into practical activities such as a workshop. However, I've also had kept a keen interest in the Queensland model of extension and spoken to Angela Williams on a couple of occasions about how that is progressing and what's involved, and have found that these 6 categories or principles that we're applying in the Burdekin fit in within the applied or the implementation component of the Queensland model of extension. And so we're working towards doing a training and a workshop with Angela Williams, and also extending some of that work through with Jerry Roberts, so that we get an understanding of we have an understanding as extension staff in the Burdekin of the Queensland model of extension as a framework, particularly in the Burdekin context, and then how the principles that have been shown in the research and come from a grazier basis in the Burdekin are then applied to deliver a consistent and effective way of extension within the Burdekin, responsive to the information that we've received from graziers, and that is being validated and supported by graziers since then. This workshop process is also to work with extension staff to have as much input and investment from staff to develop a matrix of the relevant practice change objectives in the Burdekin catchment. So identifying this, small through the medium to large practice change and how that fits into our work, and developing a means to record and measure this change. So that's the plan going forward. And as I said, this is still a process and a journey, and I don't necessarily have answers to the questions of what that matrix is going to look like and how we're going to measure that change, but bringing back something that is specifically relevant to the extension work and a whole of business that we do with graziers. So looking at their business management, reproductive management, nutrition management, grazing land management, and how all of those fit together in a complex system, and that working on one of those alone doesn't necessarily lead to effective improvements that fits within the priorities of both the graziers, but also objectives that extension staff have to meet under funding programs. Jerry, I've reached the end of the formal part of my presentation. Did you have anything that you'd like to add?
Thanks, Megan. Just a couple of things that I think about is that I think the people that we spoke to, the people that I talked with, collected the data from, like they were all pretty interested in contributing something to how extension's being delivered to them. In fact, I'd say 28 out of the 30 were sort of quite enthusiastic about it. So much so that some of the stuff that was meant to sort of take half an hour to 40 minutes, I ended up being on their place for, an hour or more. And the only time I can remember people sort of saying, we're out of time, because when the 30 minutes was up, I'd say to them, well, have you got to go? We said sort of 30 minutes, and none of them wanted to go. And the only time that ever happened was one just near dark. This fellow said he had to go and let some cattle out of the yard. So how much longer were we going to be? And so that we were about another 15 minutes or so, but we'd been there for an hour and a half. So, people were enthusiastic. I think that the way you've tied I think the original material that you looked for and found about the Queensland extension model, about the New Zealand model, and about that parental one, I think was tremendously useful to us in helping us to understand how this might go together. But other than that, no, Megan, nothing else that stands out for me other than that I think it's about service delivery. It's about what to deliver and how to bring it into a systemic approach.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Is there any questions? No?
It's Mari Vitelli here.
Thanks,
Just a couple of questions really quickly. The extension staff that you've got, the 7 in the Burdekin, what's the average duration of their employment? Are they long-term, like the Bob Shepherds of the world, or are they, is there a fairly big turnover of staff? Like often with producers, you make a relationship and get that rapport, but then if that person moves on for whatever reasons, then a new person comes on and they've got to make new relationships. How are you managing that with your extension staff?
Yeah, so within that particular group, there is probably one long-standing, and when I say long-standing, so I've been with DAF for over 15 years, so probably similar or a little bit longer, actually probably longer. And then the others were probably more in that sort of 3 to 5 year career area. And yeah, there's a very varied there. Definitely, particularly for some of, I would have said that having this process with the particularly with the 6 principles has really helped those staff to start establishing it and recognizing that building of relationships and then developing from there. And that's also where a key aspect of bringing in the Queensland model of extension as a framework, because that starts with the building of the relationships and then moving on to the implementation. Sorry, I had another thought with that, Marie, but
you're fine. Well, no, you're fine. And just one other quick question, and I'll be quiet. Back in, I think, 2015, Future Beef or Lester Paul facilitated I suppose, a grazing stakeholder workshop and producer workshop. It was titled Better Beef and Reef. It's all up on the Future Beef site. I just, some of those findings are fairly similar to where you're finding stuff. Have you used that? I know you're talking about this Queensland model of extension. I'm out of the extension theory a bit. I haven't seen that, but that Better Beef and Reef workshop really hit the nail on things that were important to producers, and as well as the appendices about producer perspectives. Have you looked at that as well in all this going forward? Over?
Yes, so I certainly did earlier on when we were doing a lot of the background. I think I've got a list of papers that are quite deep, but that has definitely been one that's been looked at and has some very key information in it.
And Barry, if I could add, I haven't looked at that one of Lester's, but I do remember when he was doing it, and I'll go and have a look at it. But I'm pleased you had, Megan, because especially the link that Mari's talking about.
I definitely had looked at it when we were sort of building all this, and then as we've developed on, I parked it, and so thank you for reminding me, because I do need to revisit it actually.
And there's one comment came in from Noel. He said he liked the way that you've engaged producers in the design of the program. So that was where we went to the 30 in the first place. Thanks, Noel.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments from anyone? So Rory, that concludes what Jerry and I had to tell everyone about. So, and I'm quite welcome. I can be contacted by email at DAF if anyone wants any more information, I'm more happy to chat to anyone that wants any more information.
Thanks, Megan, and Jerry for your input, and Mari as well, and the others. Yeah, so a nice, short, sharp, sweet one, and we'll make the recording of it available as soon as possible. And yes, I'd really like to thank you once again, Megan, for agreeing to do our webinar this time. Okay, so I guess we can all have an early mark.